By the end of the last unit, the post-classical world was drawing to a close. The Middle Ages was ending to a large degree in Europe, and indeed there were many changes as well in the rest of the world, in the post-classical world. 1450 marks the start of a new era, one that we conventionally call the start of the modern age. It is an era of tremendous change. Much of it, of course, economically driven, but also intellectual, cultural, and far more. Part of what marks the dawn of the modern era is a shift in the axis of influence. If you recall at the beginning of Unit 3, we talked about the axis that really kind of ruled the world, the connection from China to the Middle East via the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean trade routes, and so on. During this next era, from 1450 to 1750, we really see that influence shift to the development of trade routes in the Atlantic Ocean, the Atlantic trade routes. And indeed, at the end of this, what we're going to end up with is a world that is truly connected, a global world, one in which all parts of the world interact with each other. So why a modern age? Well, what marks this era is a whole lot of important things. We can start with entirely new patterns of thought in our understanding of the world, but it also marks new contact and connection between the various peoples of the world and how they interact with each other, and indeed the introduction of entirely new players to the world scene. The modern era, particularly in Europe, is marked by the end of medieval thought. Indeed, it is an era that is marked most notably by the beginning of an era that we call the Renaissance, one that gives people an entirely new sense and understanding of who we are as people and what makes us tick. Global world historians certainly recognize the significance of the Renaissance as an important part of what changes the world in the modern era. I would argue that in many cases they underplay the importance of this particular movement. It seems to me that many of the other things that mark the era couldn't happen without the developments that mark the Renaissance. But there are other things that change the patterns of thought within this era. It is the end of power structures that had run Europe during the medieval era, most notably the feudal and Catholic Church power structures that define so much of medieval Europe. Now, with the rise of another movement that we call the Reformation, there's an entirely new understanding of God and of the institutions that bring His Word to us. And indeed, this causes not only new ideas and new patterns of thought, but massive conflicts as well. Patterns of thought are also altered by what we call the scientific revolution, one which applied reason to determine the understanding of natural law and how we connect with not just our world, but indeed with our entire universe. It starts to a degree with the fellow caricatured on the right, Copernicus, who totally transforms our concept of the world and our connection to the universe and ultimately touches nearly everything. The modern era is not just characterized by changes in thought, however. There are also entirely new contacts and connections between people. As the Europeans reach out to Asia in new ways, they also find entirely new areas that they never knew existed, what we call the New World. And the result is massive impact there as well. Indeed, many global and world historians would argue that this age of exploration is what really defines the modern era and is perhaps the most important of all of the events that we're going to talk about. One of the things that makes it so confusing, however, is to recognize that these are all occurring at the same time. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution are all transforming thought at the same time as each other, and indeed, at the same time as all three of those comes the age of exploration as well. The age of exploration in particular brings new economic models to Europe. It brings new relationships between the Europeans and the rest of the world. Part of what characterizes those new relationships is the rise of colonies throughout the world. As of 1492, the Eastern and Western hemispheres become interconnected permanently for the first time. Yes, there was earlier contact. The Vikings, for example, who had found parts of North America. But now in 1492, Eastern and Western hemispheres will become linked in ways that never end. It is a permanent connection. And the result is a transformation in what the map looks like. For the sake of convenience, if you look at the the world in 1519 and the minimal amounts of areas that are under certain control, and compare that to what runs the world by the end of this era, call it 1800, you begin to see massive changes in who controls what and what happens. Other areas of the world are massively impacted as well. It's not just the old world and the new world in the sense of Europe and the Western Hemisphere, but other groups that are brought into this process. For example, Africa, that we'll need to look at. Africa is dramatically transformed by all of this, with new relationships, with new power structures, and most notably with the development of an entirely new form of slave trade that transformed Africa and indeed transformed the rest of the world as well. What we end up with is a world that is truly interconnected. And it's important to recognize the impact that that interconnection has on each other. It includes things like the exchange of plants, of animals, of ideas and culture, of things that we wouldn't even normally think about, perhaps. Disease, for example, that begin to make interconnections between the Eastern Hemisphere, Afro-Eurasia, and that of the Western Hemisphere, both North and South America. It leads to a concept that we call the Columbian Exchange, a term that was coined by a historian by the name of Crosby, and is not the trade route in and of itself, but the result of that trade route, the Columbian Exchange, how these societies interconnect and impact on each other. In addition to the changes in Europe and the various societies that they interconnect with, there are all sorts of new players throughout the world that we have to think about and we'll look at during this unit as well. Certainly one of the areas that it will have transformed is entirely new empires that arise within the Muslim world. We have spoken a little bit already about the rise of the Ottoman Empire in particular near the end of the post-classical world. But in addition to the Ottomans in what is now really the Middle East and parts of Northern Africa and so on, are the rise of other empires like the Safavids in what had been Persia and modern-day Iran. It is the rise of one of the last of the great Muslim empires within the area that is now India, the Mughal Empire. So we need to look at that impact as well. Further, there is impact and changes in terms of the connections of other societies. China, for example, that had shut itself off after the death of Zheng He in 1433, it thus plays an entirely different role in the world than it had during the post-classical era. Or Japan, who will also choose to shut itself off and change its relationship with the rest of the world during this time period. And last but certainly not least is the development of what we actually call Russia, notably under the man on the left there, Peter the Great, who integrates Russia into the world, particularly integrates them into the European world during the modern era. So how do you run all of this? How do you handle and manage all of this change? Well, one of the other things that we need to look at during the modern era, or the birth of the modern era, is two new concepts of governance. Notably, one of them that arises in England is the rise of constitutionalism, an entirely different concept and one that we've seen since arguably a little bit of Greece and Rome in the classical era and earlier. The counterpoint to that is one that we call absolutism, which arises in other places. And the model we'll look at there in particular is the one brought by this fellow, Louis XIV of France, truly one of the most colorful and interesting people in all of world history. New concepts of thought, new connections and players, new concepts of governance. What it gives rise to really in the second half, if you will, of this unit is an era that we call the Age of Reason, a movement in Europe that we call the Enlightenment, one which applies the concepts of reason and natural law to man's behavior and engages in a massive debate over the idea of constitutionalism and absolutism and government in general. What rights are we entitled to and how do we best govern ourselves? It forces us to really rethink the way nations are run and look at things in an entirely new way. The scientific revolution, exploration, things like this already had massively changed life, particularly for the Europeans and those they touched. But it also gave rise to further changes. One of the most notable being the agricultural revolution that allowed fewer people to sustain and support ever larger populations so that people were free to begin to do different things. All of this, however, begins to put stress on the economic models that we had used, and thus, by the end of the era, we had the rise of an entirely new concept, one that was introduced by this particular fellow, a guy by the name of Adam Smith, in which he created something that we call capitalism. We see the rise of an entirely new model of how our society should be run. By the end of this unit, the world is a vastly different place. Again, of course, we see massive changes in the growth of the population of the world. The population of the world roughly doubled between the years 1400 and 1800. Notably, the changes occur in places like Europe, which tripled its population due to the improvements in output and the new lifestyles that exploration and the agricultural revolution and so on afforded them to live. But it's also marked by contrasting declines in the population in places like Africa and Latin America as the Europeans dominated those people and destroyed them. In the meantime, China and India continue to grow and develop as well, and so we see this overall change in the population of the world. This massive population growth is certainly one of the notable changes that occurs during the 1450 to 1750 era, but there's more than that. Other things that have developed during this time period include, perhaps most importantly, the development of the Atlantic Ocean as the what I call the axis of influence in the world. At the beginning of this presentation, the Atlantic trade routes have become really central to what is going on. That's not to say that the Indian Ocean trade routes and the Silk Road trade routes don't still exist. Indeed, they are still there. They're just not as dominant as they once were. The Atlantic world has become what really begins to set the stage for the world. And indeed, the world is primed for even further change at this point. By 1750, there are many things brewing underneath the surface, and the world will look entirely different in the era that begins after 1750.